Welcome back to the Village Bonfire for another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. A podcast not just for your mind, but for your body and spirit too. Here we don't just talk theory. Instead, we compassionately engage with our lived experiences and a wide variety of topics together, all to invite the question, in these times we find ourselves in, how do we be more human? Thank you for being here. May these conversations awaken, inspire, repair, and evolve something deep within each of us and serve the wild, tender aliveness of our personal and collective hearts. So welcome back to another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. This will probably come out as a bonus episode. So as always, well, I'm your host, normally your host, Kate Powell, but this is a little bit of a special episode. So as kind of a, I do a lot of, lighting the fire, tending the fire, the village fire that is this podcast. And so I have Erik here with me today, who actually you'll see at some point soon an episode where I interview him, but then he was kind of like, we should really have me interview you sometimes so that people kind of get to know me a little bit more. And certainly I can ramble plenty in my conversations with other people. So you'll probably have started getting a sense of who I am through those conversations. But, there is something about, I think, knowing, who's kind of holding the heart of something that just helps strengthen those community connections and weave those webs just a little bit stronger. So, so I'm going to go ahead and light our village fire. I'm traveling, so I'm kind of out of my normal zone here, but I got the match lit. That's good. I defined matches. And so here we have our village fire lit. And we can just take a couple deep breaths in and out and kind of gather around it, settle into your body, into your space. And, there's this beautiful, sense that, at the level of energy, time and space aren't linear. And so here we are, in our own physical spaces, wherever you are right now. And then you're also settling in. As you settle into your own physical space and your body, it makes you available to settle into our virtual space of this fire. And so both of those things can be equally true at the same time. And so finding that and space where things that might seem incompatible are actually true. You can maybe take a few deep breaths in and out. And just honor whatever it is that comes up that wants to be honored most right now for you. So for me, it's like this wider web of aliveness of consciousness. I just finding myself wanting to offer up just a deep, heartfelt thank you to life, to the world around me. That we arrive in this moment.
All right. Well, I'm super excited to be kind of just jumping in here, but you're in Ireland right now. So I was Scotland. Oh,
right now.
I already got the first thing wrong. Oh God. But do you want to give maybe a little bit of kind of just an introduction, what the impetus for the trip was, why you were feeling called to go there in particular?
Yeah. Yeah, so this has kind of been a big deal for me. This has kind of been coming on for a couple of years, so it's been in the background of a lot of things in my life. Yeah, and actually, honestly, like a lot of this journey of preparation for this trip is actually probably what really got me into a place of like, okay, it's time to actually start this podcast that's been niggling at the back of my mind. So it's actually like I hadn't really put that together until just now, but I think there's like these two things are deeply interwoven, actually, this podcast and this journey, this pilgrimage really that I'm on. And so yeah, people ask me a lot, like it's funny on the trip, like so many people I'm meeting are like, oh, well, what are you doing here? And and so sort of the easiest answer is like, oh, an ancestral pilgrimage, and it is that, although I haven't taken a DNA test, I do know I know of an Irish ancestor. I don't know of any Scottish ones. But there's a lot of cultural similarities here between Ireland and Scotland. And then there was a lot of, it's funny, I heard a woman from Northern Ireland on a podcast, a storyteller from Northern Ireland on a podcast one time, and she was talking about how actually like for a long time the roads in Ireland like were not that great, and Scotland's like only 17 miles away by boat from that part of where she is in Northern Ireland. And so like it was actually easier for people to hop on boats and go get groceries in Scotland than like to go somewhere like to some big city elsewhere in Ireland. And so, there's a lot of like, yeah, just a lot of fluidity and exchange that's happened a lot, in those sort of more like benevolent ways. And then it's been interesting learning some of the history and like hearing how, you know, when like the Scottish potato famine and Highland clearances were kind of happening, that a lot of the Scots got sent to Ireland, or like if you did something wrong and you could get banished to Ireland. And I actually met this woman at a hostel my first night in Scotland, and she was telling me she's Scottish, but her ancestors, her clan ancestors, were like kind of like a little rough around the edges, like kind of, and they got in trouble with the law a lot. And so finally they got banished to Ireland, and they actually changed the spelling of their name to the Irish spelling of their clan name, which is a McAllister. And then they lived there for many years, and then they got banished from Ireland, and because they didn't reform their ways, and then like they were like on some little island kind of between the two. And then eventually they like kind of reformed enough, and they like enough time had passed that they made their way back to like mainland Scotland. So they're now back in mainland Scotland and have been for a couple generations, but their name is still spelled the Irish way, but they're Scottish. So anyway, it's just like this kind of like beautiful web. So there's a lot of, and I say beautiful, and at the same time, like there's a lot of, there's a lot of trauma and rupture and displacement and violence that's like also at the heart of a lot of that. But yeah, so that's a little bit of a tangent, but yeah, so for me, it's, yeah, so the trip is like part ancestral pilgrimage and, I mean, at its heart, that's what it is. But I think maybe deeper, like what I mean by that is, the more I do, so I have a background in energetic medicine work that is, I don't love the term shamanic for a lot of different reasons, but it is shamanic in nature. That's sort of a word that more people understand, I think. And so the more I do that work, the more I would come into contact, and the more I've worked with plant medicines and other things, the more they've kind of been showing me this, like these ruptures in my roots. And, and I think for those of us, most of us in this world where migration has happened, where colonialism has been around, where, right, like we all hold some balance of oppressor and oppressed, or colonizer and
I don't know, my brain's like drawing a blank on the other word. But
Colonized.
there we go. Yes,
And we'll go
that
with it. Yeah.
yeah, we'll go with that. I was trying to think of the other one, but anyway, whatever. Yes, that works. So we all like, I feel like we all hold some balance of those things. And so for me, part of healing the wounds of being colonizers as a European descended white bodied person in the United States, or what we call the United States, is also recognizing that my ancestors had to leave where they were originally from. My ancestors got severed from their connection with land, their connection with story, their connection with language. Um, and were colonized first, in many ways. And so for me to like kind of heal the one, I have to tend to the other as well. Um, and and to be able to just show up in the world in a really humane, whole, intact way where I become available to really build a different kind of world, to unlearn a lot of the patternings and misfunctions that we kind of just unquestioningly operate under and through in today's modern world. For me to kind of be able to build something different, I have to like unlearn those things, which means I have to find something else to put in its place. Like nature abhors a vacuum, right? And um so it's like, and so that question becomes like, who were my people, or the people who came before me? Who were they, and what songs did they sing, and what movements did their bodies make, and how did the sounds of their language like fill their mouths, and what plants were they working with, and what stories were they telling, and songs they were singing, right? Like all of those things, how did all of that developed in relationship with place and with land? And so when they were more connected to the land, where were they and who were they? And so for me, it's like, yeah, if I can feel back and like find those threads and kind of bring them forward, then it's like once they're in my body, then a whole world of possibilities starts to open up for me in terms of how I can move through this world in a different way, and new options start to appear, and like how can I take what's best from that world and best from this world and like sow seeds for something different. Yeah, and I talk, I'm aware I'm talking a lot, but just kind of this, so it's like I
It's your
feel
podcast. Like this
it.
is your interview. Go for it.
That's true. Thank you. um I've been conceiving of it. So I talk a lot about culture, and you know, for me, it's kind of like, so there's sort of personal culture and societal culture, right? So there's like the arts, the musics, the things that we've created, right? That are like one form of culture. And then there's also like our energy fields, which are like the petri dishes that are the cultures within which our cells develop and grow, the environments where our cells develop and grow. And so, and these two things interact with each other and kind of bounce off of each other and are informed by each other. But if we want to create different external culture, we have to like create different internal culture, and vice versa in some ways. So it's like I see culture in that way, but then I also see these like layers of culture where there's like our modern culture, which has its certain values, its certain assumptions, its certain perspectives. And then there's sort of this like ancestral remembering culture that is still alive, like in our DNA, in our bones in some way. Like we don't evolve that quickly. Like our brains move really fast, but like our actual physical evolution happens. I mean, it's not close to a geological time scale, but it's like more like that than a technological time scale. And so like our nervous systems still relate to things as if we were like in caves, you know? There's not a whole lot that's changed in them, like in the last like four, whatever thousand years. So, you know, so it's like we have these two cultures, and it's like I think we're living in these spaces of dissonance between them, you know, and so it's like I'm feeling also this invitation to really uh, tap into this older, more animistic, more land-based um, culture, and see again, like I said, what that awakens in my body, what possibilities that starts to open up for me, you know, not in some like Pollyanna kind of way of like, oh, everything was perfect back in the day. Like, no, violence has always been there. And like, you know, life was really hard and life expectancy was short. And, you know, but there's also, it feels like we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater in some ways. And there's things that have gotten lost that we might do well to remember and see what they have to offer us, how they can bring us into a different relationship with the here and now so that we can maybe make different choices or relate to things that are more modern in a way that then allows us to use them in ways that are more humane and less dehumanizing. Um, yes, I think I'll pause there.
Yeah, a lot of threads.
Yeah.
No, I love kind of what you're saying. I mean, I feel like United States culturally, or whatever this melting pot on the best of days that we're trying to envision it as, it almost has a sublimating effect of especially generationally. I with my family, we're of Hungarian descent. On some sides of it, and I actually have a funny story about apparently one of my great somethings. He ended up somewhere in Germany. He was kind of like a vagabond, and he saw this street named Egging, and he within our kind of genealogy, we found that he probably just stole the name so that he could not be Hungarian anymore, and just adopted a brand new identity. But a lot of like my grandparents and my uncles, they will talk about how, you know, when they first came over to the United States, I think it was like in the late 1800s, 1890s, I believe, just this loss of those traditions before, or that came from like the homeland, in an effort to kind of fit in and to be able to exist in this space. And if we look back at, you know, not too long ago, the othering that occurred on a immigration level. I mean, the level of detail of breakdown of like racial purity of white versus non-pure white was so granular, and you had so many people just venting their traditions, venting their native language, venting their stories to become American, or to fit into the current power structures, or the power structures that existed in their day. And it's almost like this, a weird complicity in your own colonization, I guess, where it's like you're giving up, you are forced to give the things up to fit in. I think there's something really subtle and insidious about that, because it's hard to kind of look back at those traditions and those roots. It's like, oh, nobody forced you necessarily to give them up, but that was the only way to move forward in society. And obviously, for other you know, ancestral lineages, other races, that giving up was much more, but it still existed. And so being in this space of like, what are some of the deeper roots that my family's or my genetics or whatever used to, you know, utilize as a either a storytelling method or a sensory a way of making sense of the world, or embedding meaning into everyday life, what was given up. And so I kind of love that that's kind of part of that. I think if I'm not mistaken, somewhat of what you're touching on is this kind of trying to connect to what came before, what was given up, and maybe healing some of those wounds, some of those divides. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. I don't know if that
Yeah.
sparks anything for you or,
Yeah. 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 I mean, so much of what you're pointing to, it's normal, right? It's nervous system. Like that's the ventral vagal branch of the nervous system, right? It's like under, we're hardwired for belonging, to feel safe and secure in a sense of belonging. And where we feel like that's under threat, fawning and fitting in become our go-to responses. Um, and so, yeah, so yeah. So anyway, so yes, there's a lot that, and obviously, yeah, it's very different then because there's like kind of this continuing tension for, people who are more melanated, for example, because they like can't fit in to whiteness, like physically, visually. So yeah, it becomes really complicated, but absolutely, there's a lot of this, even in places where it was a choice, and nobody was forcing anybody to do it. Like, it's like, but yeah, like you said, if you have to do it to survive, is it really a choice? And so, I mean, I think that's for me, some of this is like, I've been doing a lot of work to like expand my nervous system's capacity for more healthy conflict and for more challenge, because I think that's like a really important skill in terms of being resilient and being courageous, and we need resiliency and courage, like if we're carving new pathways and like building new cultures and going against the status quo, or being a leader in any kind of way in a community, or trying to build something into the world that a lot of people might not understand, or might not be their thing. And so that was like another piece for me, I think, of prompting some of this like ancestral remembering, was realizing like, oh, there's a part of me right now that will always feel a little fragile until it's been tended to. And it's where there's still wounding, where my ancestors chose fawning and fitting in, and and because at the level of energy, time and space aren't linear, when I start to make different choices, that actually heals the line back as well as forward. So it's like there's also a part of me that's doing this for them. And that's a piece of this trip too, I think, because, I'm also not under any illusions that I show up here and these countries are, I mean, Scotland is still a part of Britain, right? Like colonization is like still sort of actively happening. And that's a really contentious issue over here, actually, like whether to be independent or not. They actually had a referendum not that long ago, and by a very slim margin voted to stay with England. But it's like a much more complicated, it's a very complicated, topic of conversation. And I think a lot of Scots people feel very complicated in their hearts about that, from what I can tell anyway. And so I'm under no illusion that these places are somehow going to like magically have answers for me. Like they're modern countries grappling with many of the same challenges that like we are in the US. And I heard someone, Stephen Jenkinson, I think it was, one time said, you know US, like, and Canada, like we're a nation of flight risks, like nervous system wise, because our ancestors are the ones who ran,
Yeah.
and so here I'm like surrounded by the ones who stayed. And so it's the trauma has like a slightly different flavor to it, right? Like those ancestral wounds have like slightly different flavors. So it's very interesting. But so like really what was calling me over was the land, actually, the land itself. And so a couple of years ago, it was like I started seeing pictures popping up everywhere because there's been a huge renaissance of tourism in both of these countries. And I would like feel it like a hook behind my belly button, like tugging, or then I would like feel. And so I started to just have a sense of what these places feel like, the feeling tone of the land here. And it would be like, I'd be going throughout my day and I would just like feel them next to me, just like walking beside me. Or, you know, they'd show up in dreams or whatever. And so like, it felt like the land was saying, you know, there was an invitation to come in back into relationship with the land. And so I started learning Irish Gaelic, Gaeilge, back in February. I started working with songs, ancestral songs, old songs of these countries and others of Europe. I yeah, just started connecting more with some of the myths and archetypal characters and some of the like ancestral characters. And, you know, there's a whole episode with Jen Murphy on sort of mythical ancestors of Ireland and here on the podcast. But anyway, so yeah, so I was finding these different ways to try and connect in, you know, eat some of the foods, find out what kind of plants grow here, connect with some of them, you know. I like was playing around for a while, experimenting with different like Irish soda bread recipes, you know, and like eating a lot of Irish soda bread and you know, and so it's all in a way of kind of because doing all those things helps reawaken those frequencies within my body, helps reawaken those rememberings, and helps me kind of keep saying yes to the invitation that the land was offering until it was time for me to actually come here. And then it's been really interesting coming here. I've been here about a week so far. And, you know, I know better than to think that like, I know how it's going to turn out, but there's still always a part of me that's kind of floored by like, just how not prepared you can ever really be for something like this and how little it's going to let itself be planned or controlled. And I've been really surprised at how disconnected I actually feel now that I'm here, like from the land and then also from myself. And I'm like, okay, what's going on? And like, there's been a lot of waves of grief that have been coming up and it's like, I'm having this sense of like, almost that like even though I really quickly flew across the ocean, that there's like this energetic component that's like slowly like at the pacing of a ship like retracing itself to like catch up to me. Like I don't know, it's very strange. So there's like that piece of things. And you know, in the work that I do, sometimes when we do soul retrievals or aspect retrievals, you know, it's like there's a part of us that maybe we sent to live outside of ourselves. And when the time comes to bring that part back home, it's like that part's a little balloon floating somewhere in our energy fields outside of us. And the cord that's still tethering it is full of all the reasons, the energy of all the reasons that we sent it to live outside of us in the first place. And so as it comes in, first we have to kind of like tend to like those pieces. And so it feels like that's a little bit what's happening on this trip is it's like before I can actually really land here, I'm like having to tend to just like massive amounts of grief. And then also like Scotland actually apparently historically was one of the most enthusiastic countries in Europe in its burning of witches. So there's like a lot of like witch wound that's been really reactivated actually within me. And I'm noticing that my nervous system is just in this kind of constant state of like just wanting to be small and not seen and hiding. And I'm like, ooh, like that's interesting. So there's also this like ancestral piece of like what it is to be coming onto this land as someone who stepped back into medicine healing. And I had a spontaneous past life regression one time where it was like I was just sitting and I was in ceremonial circle in my training, and it was like all of a sudden I felt this tightening happening around my throat, my ankles, and my wrists, and I felt like my body wanted to go into this like cross position, and then I felt this heat start at my feet and slowly move all the way up my body, and I was like, oh, my cells, the cells of my body are remembering being crucified and burned at the stake for being a witch. Ah, interesting. So there's like something about that I think is like coming up. And then there's also just kind of the like dissonance of like, yes, the land called me here and I've been doing all this like ancestral remembering work. And then I come here, but it's like there's this modern culture. And so it's like I'm operating at this like very different cultural frequency than what's there, partly because I'm also not I'm not actually of these lands, obviously. Like I'm of the US, you know. I mean, it's where I was born and raised, and I have my own connection with the land there from years of farming and other types of ritual and ceremony work. So so it's been very interesting, like to see how it's like, yeah, I have no idea where this pilgrimage is actually taking me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's been really humbling so far in the last week.
Absolutely. Yeah, so many things kind of just popping up around that of, I like when you were talking about like the land calling you or feeling that tug. I think a lot of people who get into kind of medicine work or start working with either, plant medicines or energy work, there's typically some kind of component of feeling like you're being called somewhere. And there's always that kind of that interesting, I think I just had that when I went to Peru. I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, I felt very called. It's like, you need to go to the Amazon. You need to go to the Amazon. Um, and I think that's what started a lot of my medicine work with plant medicine specifically, just for me personally. And then getting there and just it being so different. And so, there was just so many things about that experience that, you know, it took a little while to kind of get used to. And a lot of the traditions, I started attending ceremonial spaces here in the US where some of the stuff has been a little, I don't know, updated or maybe geared more towards people in the US. And then going down, to Peru and experiencing like a very traditional kind of ceremonial experience was just like, oh man, it was like a shoe that didn't quite fully fit. But at the same time, I learned so much, you know what I mean? But I'm definitely resonating with that kind of feeling of like, ooh, kind of want to feel small right now. I don't know, like this is not quite what I expected, but I'm here, but I'm not sure. So yeah, I'm definitely experiencing some sympathetic nervous system activation on that one. I'm like, oh man, I just did this back in February. Damn, and I'm still integrating it. Oops. One of the things I wanted to kind of maybe ask you about or kind of tie back into, you mentioned earlier about how it kind of just popped into your head, but the podcast was kind of born out of this same maybe call. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about how the two of them, maybe the nature of what you feel the work of the podcast, what you're trying to accomplish with it is, maybe talk a little bit about storytelling, that type of thing, or yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just listening in for a moment. Because there's something I feel like kind of opened up a little bit in what you were just sharing that I think I want to kind of like speak to quickly, and then we'll kind of go there if that's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I feel like, you were talking about trying to kind of piece together, these like going over there and being like, oh, everything's so different and trying to piece things together. And I don't know, that stirred for me too. I mean, I think it's really, especially like Celtic, sort of ancient Celtic, early Celtic. I mean, even the word Celtic is like actually kind of controversial. Like, what does that actually even mean? And there's been this whole like new age, for some reason, like Celtic mythology seems like it's really at the heart of kind of this like new age pan paganism, like spirituality kind of thing. And so it's also interesting to kind of be trying to piece like what's that, which is like, you know, it's fine, but it may not actually have its roots in something authentic, you know. And then there's like the really dry academic like approach, you know. And so it's also very interesting to kind of encounter, yeah, like these, there are some people who are like very, very anti the like new age kind of Celtic stuff, and are very into like the dry academic rememberings of the myth and holding on to the old ways. And then there are like kind of this like new agey free for all, and then there's kind of like something in between. So anyway, I don't know, that was just kind of like coming to me as you were sort of speaking. You know, there's so many different ways we can try to access this stuff, and so many different approaches. And so to also be in a place where like as a visitor, it's like I can't say what's right or wrong, you know, but like I just have to keep finding what feels right to me and for me, you know. um but yeah, so as relates to the podcast, yeah, so you know, I think for a long time I kept trying to figure out, like I sort of had this like quiet whispering nudge to like make a podcast, you know. And I think for a really long time, I kept holding off, partly because I was like, it doesn't make sense. Like, that's like a thing for another time. Like, I have to have more of my stuff together in different ways before I can like devote time to that. And, you know, so there was like that piece of things. But then there was also like that I was just kind of like, what would I even talk about? Like, what would it actually be about? What is like the heart of it, you know? And finally I kind of came to a place where it was like, okay, you got to just start and like let the heart of it kind of like come to be in the doing, you know. But um but I would say, you know, in a lot of ways it did come about because I was looking around me and I was getting kind of tired of talking about the kind of world that I wanted to see, or sort of like the ways in which the ancestral rememberings that I was awakening to through my more energetic healing work, through, you know, um, my ancestral remembering work, like, you know, through these things. It was like, the more I got into that, the more I could see a different way of doing things in the world here and now, you know. And I kept like talking about it with people and talking about it with people. And then it was like, I was tired of talking about it. And I was like, but what am I building in the world that's actually going to start bringing this into being, you know? And so for me, it really like, it felt like it was a chance for me to, yeah, put my actions where my mouth is in some ways. And like, and also then to just kind of keep testing my own capacity to like steward the vision, to hold the heart of what it is I wanted to see in the world. Like, you know, because I was like, okay, it's easy to talk about the world we want to see, but like, can I actually build something that is of that world I want to like grow into? Like, do I have the skills to actually like show up in the way that theoretically I want to be able to show up, you know? So I think that was then a piece of it. And then, you know, I also say a lot, like, you know, a lot of clients come to me, you know, I've started talking about my work more instead of a healer as like a ceremonialist, because a lot of my clients come to me about, starts with like a personal issue or some sort of acute specific moment or trauma or whatever that they're trying to work with. And then it kind of like spirals back to like something that happened when they were younger. And then it like all of a sudden widens out, and we realize, oh, actually the roots of this are like ancestral collective societal, whatever, right? Like a much bigger, wider, deeper. And so then they start kind of having these ancestral rememberings, you know? And so it's this question of like, and then they turn to me and they're like, well, now that I like don't fit in with my family and with this and with that, and, you know, with my group of friends, and, you know, how do I find more people who want, who see things the way I do, or who are working to build a new world in a different way, or, um, you know, you can feel when people have done this work because there's like a deeper rootedness to those people. There's like a different quality or tone. I think that's my experience anyway. And so, you know, once people start to find that within themselves, there's a hunger then to find the community of other people who also hold some of that tone, you know? And so it like also then became like, okay, how do I start to, I know all these amazing people. How do I start to like create a space where people can come together? And, you know, and storytelling itself is an ancestral remembering, you know. We used to do so much more storytelling. Let me rephrase that. We used to do so much more intentional storytelling. Back when we were more oral, when our ancestors were more in an oral tradition and an oral society, you know. And we still do lots of storytelling. I mean, that's the voice in my head is constantly narrating what I'm doing and like, right. And like, or how I'm feeling about what I'm doing, or telling me stories about what someone else might be thinking about what I just did, and like all these other things. So there's like, you know, stories are still everywhere, but stories as medicine and as eldering practice and as keeper of wisdom rather than just entertainment has gotten lost, you know. And where it feels that way to me anyway. There's still places, pockets in the world where I think that's still more a thing. And actually, like Ireland and Scotland are some of those places. And that was also part of why, for me coming here, I was like, oh, I'm just interested to see what it feels like to be in a place where storytelling, the good, they call it the blether, the like, you know, like gossiping, talking nonsense, chatting for hours on end, you know, where that's like still just such a part of the culture. Yeah. So, you know, so it felt like somehow, like on some subconscious level, that all kind of wove together, like as sort of a semi-social experiment, semi like seeing a vacuum of like wanting to demonstrate to people this is what it looks like to be in public medicine space, right? Because that's the other thing too. Healing has become so behind closed doors, one-on-one, you know, separate from life. And, you know, that wasn't always the case. And it certainly doesn't have to be the case. And in fact, I think actually we have to have the opposite be true. Yes, go do your one-on-one when and where that's appropriate, but also like collective repair is an important part of things. And so like, yeah, so then it felt like it was like bringing healing spaces into public so that they weren't this like hidden thing. And then it's like, well, that's what we did around the fire, right? We gather around the fire, and sometimes it was entertainment and sometimes it was cathartic, and, you know, but always it was humanizing and a way of like weaving these webs of connection in ways that feel really grounding to our nervous systems and really reparative in that way. And so yeah, so I think that's like at the heart of kind of what the podcast is. And then, as like with anything, you know, that I think is really done with intention and sort of some sense of sacredness, as you start to do it, it like works you back, you know. And so then I feel like it's opened me up to this whole different sense of like, oh, what is it to be a fire keeper in the old ways? Oh, what is it to deepen even more into understanding what story as medicine means? And so that's kind of sent me on some of these personal inquiries. Um, and so I think those are also things that are kind of at the heart of then my trip here, you know. Yeah.
Oh, I love, yeah. So much about what you're saying just like really resonates with me just on a level of the power of storytelling, especially when you get intentionality around it. Can be such medicine. I think we have a tendency to psychologize, a lot of this stuff. So it's the internal, oh, those are just negative thought patterns. Those are, but they're stories. Our mind is telling us stories all of the time. And a lot of the times they're not even our own stories. They're stories we've picked up, especially in today's day and age with, your TikToks and all that kind of stuff. We're just pouring data, narratives into our brain. And it is so disorienting, especially at that rapid pace. And so by bringing that intentionality back, I think can be very therapeutic. And when you were talking about earlier about that thing that wanted to come through before we jump to the podcast part, where you were talking about people talking, the traditionalists within Celtic mythology versus the people who wanted it to be more new age, more alive, is something that I've seen a lot in, religious debates. And there's a biblical scholar I really like named Dan McClellan. He's on TikTok. He's pretty up there, but he talks about negotiating with the text, and he talks about how every people's, when it comes to the Bible, but I think this is with every, and I'm not meaning this pejoratively. I know some people really love their specific book, but when it comes to different mythologies, we're always negotiating with them. And I think the richness is when we allow it to be fluid and alive and bringing ourselves in this, time space part of the continuum into and interfacing with those narratives and those collective, constructions, because these are traditions that were passed down. It wasn't like a singular, unilateral voice that brought these mythologies to us. They were added to, they were enriched, had parts stripped away, they were molded by humanity, and ultimately, to me anyway, every mythology is a human story. And one of the things that really comes up for me, on the episode that we've recorded, I don't know what order this will come out in, but when we were talking about like fundamentalist religion versus, something spiritual, something a little bit more alive, there's a story in the Bible that, as a fundamentalist believer, it was the resurrection of Lazarus, who had died. And, when I was studying it as a very a good fundamentalist religious, this is inerrant, perfect, this is exactly how this story, it wasn't even a story, it was fact. And, there, as you're going through the story of Lazarus, there is a moment, and it's the shortest scripture in or verse, I think, and it's Jesus wept. And as you're reading it, in a very literalistic, fundamentalist way, it kind of like, you're like, why is he weeping? Why, and then to recap the story a little bit, Jesus had to go away to, I think, avoid the authorities. And at the time, Lazarus was very sick. And as he was coming back, Lazarus dies. Lazarus was, waiting to be healed. And Jesus shows up and he raises him from the dead. And you're sitting there and you're like, well, Jesus knew he was going to raise him from the dead. Why did he weep before raising him from the dead? Like, it's super odd when you project onto the Jesus figure this almost abstract deification. But then as I revisited the story as a mythology after I was no longer, a believer, per se, there's something like that very human that came out from it. And that Jesus weeping, and I can't remember, there was another biblical scholar who kind of dissected it in this way. Jesus was weeping because of he was weeping with those who were grieving the death of Lazarus. So he knew that he was going to raise him from the dead within the mythological story. That was what was always going to happen. You know, it was this deep level of empathy with humanity, that he weeps at the pain of loss, of death. It's such a human moment in this book that, you know, I had completely missed, you know, when I was like, no, this is just obviously a Jesus miracle because he's literally the Son of God and the one true God and all that kind of stuff. And when you step back and let the story itself breathe and allow us to bring our humanity to those stories and allow other people to bring their humanity to the stories, there's something deeper that kind of opens up. And I'm finding this with a lot of spiritual traditions, a lot of mythologies. When you really sit with the texts or with the stories that have been told and allow them to kind of be alive in this interplay between what we're bringing to the story and what the story is, you know, has been preserved, and then culturally what's being fed into the story, it kind of blossoms, you know, and it becomes this multidimensional thing that I would argue almost transcends, you know, humanity. And in our worst moments, we've got this beauty of depth that is conveyed through storytelling. And so the idea of kind of reclaiming, you know, that power again without needing things to be literal or whatnot, and trying to harbor or, you know, foster that around a fire. I absolutely love it. So I don't know if that holds anything else up.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's yeah, I had something and then something else kind of started to come in, and then it was like, where'd that original thread go? Sorry, there's also like jet lag kicking in. So it's like okay. My brain's ability to track all the threads is like definitely like a little different. But
this is a bonus episode
than usual. It is. I know. People get to bonus listen to me be awkward.
As opposed to the authentics. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The unbonus awkward, the regular awkward. Yeah. Well, so so the beauty, yes, there it is. Okay. So the beauty of telling stories and receiving stories in community is that each person is going to hear something different in the story. And so when I've sat in on really beautifully facilitated story circles, there's the storyteller who shares the story. And then there's an opportunity for people to like engage with it, you know, and sort of say, wow, like I found myself really repulsed by this one character in that story, or like I found myself like way over identifying with this character, or I found myself like really stuck on this one moment and this thing that happened, right? And it always relates back to something in the person who's like sharing that, but it also then deepens our collective reading of the story. So it's also a way actually of tapping into a podcast episode that I think will come out before this, but hasn't come out yet with Kat. We talk about sort of this wider web of consciousness, and that we all like are like nodes, synapses in this like wider, each of us is a unique synapse in this wider web of consciousness, right? And that knowledge and wisdom aren't like owned by any one person. It's like a collective, you know, pool. And so when we tell stories in community and receive stories in community, it's like we're seeing those synapses firing in real time in a way that evolves all of us who are present for that. And so whether it's myth or even whether it's someone sharing their own story, right? Like, I mean, that's the beauty of relationship. Like, you have your perception of this conversation that we're having, and I have my perception of this conversation that we're having, and they're not the same, you know?
Yeah. Unfortunately,
like,
yeah.
I mean,
Or fortunately,
unfortunately,
but I think there's that piece of us that really wants to be like, oh, I want to know what they, I want to be on the same page.
Of
But I
course.
do think the beauty is born out of the fact that no, it's always going to be different. There's always
Right.
going to be something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that part of us that wants that sameness is like also the parts of our nervous systems that, again, like maybe have some more stretching or growing they could do in our capacity for like to tolerate more difference, right? And like, and it's also just, I see the world I see so clearly that I just assume everybody else sees it the same way because it's so obvious to me, but like that's where the ecosystem becomes richer through the biodiversity, right? Because if it were all the same, then how boring and nothing would evolve because
Yeah.
it would literally all be obvious and the same. And so it's through the tension and the clashing and the mirroring and the like, oh my God, you said this and that sparked this in me. Oh my gosh. And then this sparked this in me. Right. And then it's like, it's through that back and forth that something deeper and richer starts to like come out. And so when we tell our own stories, right? Like I gave this example, I think in a podcast recently, but I remember, oh yeah, I was in the podcast with Stella. I was in that episode. And yeah, I was talking about how I was out at dinner with a friend. We were at a seafood restaurant and I was like, oh, I don't know. I'm not much of a seafood person. I mean, I like shrimp and I like scallops. And I like lobster. And I like, and I start listing, I like salmon. I like tuna. And she's like, I think you might need to change that story about yourself that you're not a seafood person. And so it's like a very silly, simple example, but like how often I was just remembering earlier tonight too, this time that, I had just finished teaching a small group course and I was getting feedback from some of the people who were in it. It was a pilot run of the course. And one of the women was giving me feedback and she was like, well, I find myself wanting part two, which is like you to teach me how to like be in ritual more often and like be in ceremony more often. And like my initial thing was like, well, who the hell am I to teach that? Like I do not do my daily meditation. I don't do this. I don't do that. Like I have this altar space and I like rarely show up at it. I'm terrible at that kind of stuff. And so that's like a thought that immediately starts going through my head. And then she's like, because I mean, that's just so innate to how you move through the world. And I'm like, like what? And so in those moments, like there are times where people tell us how they perceive us in ways that like don't feel good, right? Or that we're like, that's really more about you than it is about me. And then there are the times where people perceive us in ways that we don't perceive ourselves, that it's like, oh, I think there's an invitation for me here to shift my own story about myself or to see myself in a different way. And like not in a, I'm going to try to imagine how someone else is imagining me kind of way. Cause like that's usually about us leaving and like giving power away, but like it's bringing me back to myself and it's helping me tap deeper into the power that's within me and inviting me into a deeper responsibility for the power that's within me. And so, I mean, that's really like at their best, that's what relationships do is they help us grow our own stories about ourselves, actually. And so, again, I mean, what a powerful thing to be in story in community. And I'll say too, there's this other piece. There's a Scottish storyteller. I'm hoping will come on the podcast. We haven't been able to get the timing quite right yet to record an episode, but I've heard him say, and I'm going to like do a terrible job paraphrasing it. So it'll be much better if I can get somebody on the podcast who can like really flesh this out. But it's, at least in sort of the Scottish tradition and possibly the Irish as well, they talk about sort of like three different types of stories. And so there are the ones that are meant to entertain. There are the ones that are meant to, and so those can like grow and evolve and whatever. And then there are the ones that are meant to sort of guide and like offer a little bit of wisdom, right? And so those can also kind of grow and morph and whatever. And then there are the ones that like hold knowledge, right? Because again, this was back when cultures were oral. And so, they were the textbooks, right? They were the way things have been, or the historical records, or the lineages and genealogies, or the plant medicine records, like how do we know which plants do what and how to work with them, or whatever it might be. And those, it was really important for the storyteller. Their role in those was to memorize them exactly and not deviate. And those only certain people got initiated into, and you had to be initiated into it because it was like your story to tell, kind of. That's my understanding anyway. So again, we'd have to get more of an expert on to like actually verify that I'm remembering that correctly and transmitting that correctly. But like, I think that's such a fascinating concept too, right? Because again, I think we kind of live in this world where we think of ones to inspire and ones to entertain and ones to like evoke catharsis maybe. But it's like we also have this, there's fact and there's fiction. And most cultures blended those a little bit more, I think. But then there was still some distinction on like which stories you could have more of and which stories like had to hold a certain through line, you know. There was something you had said earlier that kind of sparked that too. So that's why I just added that in there.
No, I absolutely loved it. And more nowadays, I'm finding that there's so many stories masquerading as entertainment that are actually kind of pushing us to accepting a moral framework that uncritically. And I don't want to shit on anybody who loves Marvel movies, but I've been really thinking a lot about the cultural phenomenon of Marvel movies, and I'm like, the level of just American
propaganda
imperialism that is just softballed into our consciousness, and the way that we were raised. I was raised to love these heroes, and you're just sitting there and you're like, oh, these heroes are just like reinforcing some of the worst parts of late stage capitalism and imperialism, and we're just sitting there being like, oh yeah, Tony Stark, he's the ethical billionaire, and you're just like, is that something that we should be relying on, or like uncritically just being like, oh, an ethical billionaire will fix this all, it's fine, let's just keep and so I'm finding that with so much of what we consider entertainment, there are moral dimensions that are, again, I think, bypassing our conscious mind and just subconsciously being fed into us. And we don't realize that we're adopting these narratives of how we should be, completely uncritically. And I'm not saying like it's all some insidious, they know their fingers are on the levers. I think it's just part of some of the technological vehicles by which they're being delivered. And I think stepping back and getting a little bit more intentional about storytelling, really looking at it as a medicine practice, also looking at it as a human practice, or something that is enriching when utilized, with that kind of reverence for it. I think that almost makes us a little bit more immune to some of those cultural narratives, some of the stuff that is just critically not being analyzed, and we're just kind of accepting as oh, this is what it means to be human, or this is what it means to exist in this society. I do want to be kind of a little conscious time wise, because I know we're getting kind of close to your hard stop, but was there anything else that like maybe wants to come through right now, or that kind of closing up thoughts or things of that nature?
Yeah, well, just quickly, I love what you said there, and actually, I talk about that a little bit in the episode with Dan McNeil. We sort of talk a little bit about Superman and kind of this, like how easy it is to wait for heroes to like come save us, and and I'm certainly not an expert in sort of like early myths of any culture, so I don't know that I can I think some element of story has always been a little bit about propaganda and sort of like also like reinforcing kind of our like collective sense of identity, right? And
Oh,
so
you say you're not familiar, but you like nailed it. That's like anytime you get back to like Epic of Gilgamesh or even like traditional biblical scholars, they'll be like, okay, so yeah, that genocide that they said they did in the Old Testament was actually when they were being oppressed, and it was kind of a revenge fantasy, and it never happened. We have no archaeological evidence, so you were spot on. Maybe
yeah.
you
Well, there
jumped
you
ahead of
go.
grade.
Yeah. Nice. Yes. Put that little gold star on my shirt. Um, there's my inner Hermione coming out. But yeah, no, it's so I think that's there's frequently been an element of that, right? And that's certainly, I think we see that a lot in all of the big like war sagas, and there's always like these heroes and kind of grappling with these like big concepts of what is it to be human, and doing that in the form of kind of these reluctant heroes, these tortured heroes, these, right, and on these like massive epic scales, and I think there's something in us that does really lean towards that. But I've heard Sophie Strand and then other people speak about like what was it when our myths though were rooted in a place and in a landscape, and once they got written down, then they became translatable into other languages, and they started to move around from place to place. And so suddenly they're not rooted in the earth anymore. And so they have this, I think they become a little bit more at the mercy of whatever our current zeitgeist is. And so rather than them, they become reflections of us more than being something that we can attune to, or that's something that can kind of help keep us grounded in some way. Yeah. And let's see, there was another like little thread there. Um, we'll see. I don't know if it'll come back. Um, yeah, there was something because you were talking about Marvel, and yeah, and I mean, I totally hear you because I both love Marvel and also kind of hate it,
Mhm.
Um, really a lot of the superhero ones, but but again, it's like oh yes, there it is. And so, but I think some of it too is that we don't always know how to receive stories either, actually. And so I've been doing a lot of work like, well, I was reading Women Who Run with Wolves by Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And I think she does a really beautiful job of kind of breaking down this like, and I've heard other storytellers kind of explain this too. It's like we can read or receive oral stories, hear stories on like these multiple layers, right? So stories can either be that every character in the story is an aspect of a single psyche, or it can be that the characters represent different forces, different psyches, like kind of interacting with each other. And so it can be a guide towards like relationships and the different kind of forces that might show up in our collective, in our culture, in our community, in our, and be a way of kind of exploring how we navigate those pieces. And sometimes the story can be both of those things at the same time. And so there's also, I think there's a little bit of a lost art too, like what you were talking about. I think some of where we get in trouble with some of these movies and characters that on the surface appear to be very like just sort of your typical like epic, question of what is it to be human, right? And then underneath are like actually reinforcing a lot of like, yeah, really imperialistic or just a lot of the modern ills, kind of the things that are in that modern culture that are really dissonant with this animistic older culture. And and so I think, like you were talking about with a lot of the like fundamentalists, I think we read those too fundamentally in some ways, actually, and too like literally, and we forget, we've like lost some of the art of like looking at things symbolically and actually saying like, what if each of us, rather than picking which superhero we're the most like, what if each of them represented a different piece of our own psyches that are like vying for, you know, I mean, I don't know, supremacy in some ways, awkward, but not wrong. But or it's or like they're bouncing, it's like it's how they bounce off of each other. It's not so much about the individuals. It's like we go to a character like Captain America and everyone, or like Thor, or whatever, and everyone's like all about just like every aspect of that one character. And it's like that one character is actually a symbol for a concept that we're trying to like make more tangible in a way, and then see how that concept interacts with its environment through these different trials and tribulations. And so like at its heart, I think they can become that again, although that's not how they're mostly made, and that's not mostly how we're engaging with them. But like that would be, I think, an example of like starting to look at these stories in ways that are more symbolic, and starting to then find a wider wisdom, or find some different inspiration, or find more possibility, rather than more of the same. Yeah.
So many. I have so many things. I mean, we can get into Aristotelian virtue ethic and competing teleologies through the mythologization of like superheroes. And we'll have to save it for another one. But
another time. Yeah,
another time. But I have so many of these thoughts. I will sit there and I'm just like, is it all just evil? Or maybe it's just our way of negotiating various ways of being in the world, and there's an ontological attempt or approach to kind of reconcile these things before it gets back into the real world. Love it.
Yeah.
I absolutely
I mean,
love
I think it's always that. And, the question, who's creating it, and what's their agenda? Like, who's telling stories, and what's their agenda, and where's the money? Right.
Yeah. Follow where's the money?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Well, yeah.
I was going to say, I'm going to officially turn it back to you, just so if you want to kind of close it out. We did not rehearse what to do when I was done,
we sure
taking the lead on the interview. So
yeah,
this is
this is real time figuring it out. So we'll just take a couple deep breaths in and out together, and hopefully you heard something in this that sparked something for you, or that awoke something in you, or that made you that made you feel like you could belong around this fire. And I think that's some of what I guess my hope would be for me, kind of putting myself out there a little bit more, and letting you know kind of a little bit more about me, and sort of as the fire tender is, inviting you to belong here. So I don't know, I just want to bring one hand to my chest, and you're welcome to do the same if you'd like, and just take a couple deep breaths in and out, and just in the same way that we kind of arrived in our bodies to arrive in this space, we'll kind of come back into our bodies if we've sort of gotten caught up in the swirl of the conversation, and do so as a way of then preparing to actually leave the space and to close out this fire for right now, for this time, and to sort of close out that being in both these planes at once, your actual physical space and then our virtual fire, and to let yourself just come back into your physical space, and yeah, knowing that we'll meet again. So thank you, Erik, and yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. So until next time.
Hi, Kate here again. Thank you for gathering with us. Whether you've been here a while or found your way here thanks to today's guest, it means so much to me and the world I dream of to have you here. I hope you'll tune in for more of our conversations. We humans seem to be at a profound threshold and facing questions of deep impact for the future and the world. We need our full hearts and humanity as we sow seeds of change in these times of joy and heartbreak. I count myself lucky to be here now, around this virtual village fire, weaving our stories into a medicine with humans like you. As a community medicine space, this podcast is relational. It weaves webs of connection and mutual respect and care across time and space. If you appreciate and support the future we're seeding here, you can support the weaving of this web in a few ways. 1, share episodes with friends and family or online with your community. It also helps the podcast immensely if you like, rate, subscribe to, or follow the podcast where you watch or listen, so you get notified when new episodes drop and new listeners find us as they search. 2, join us on Patreon. Doing so supports conversations like the one you just heard and allows you access to live community gatherings and medicine circles and more as we continue to grow. It also helps me keep the space advertisement-free so the conversations stay intact as they are. If you have questions, suggestions, connections, or would like to find out more about working with me, you can find me online at www.wildsacredjourney.com, on Instagram at wildsacredjourney_KP, or email me, kate@wildsacredjourney.com. Until next time, from my heart to yours, I release today's fire with a prayer for our individual and collective wholeness, connection, and joy. May it be so.